With the release of the new North Africa Mid-War Forces book for Flames of War, I thought that it was a good time to show you how to paint some more tiny 15mm scale tanks. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this tutorial I'll be showing you how I painted this M3 Lee in a scheme based on that used by US forces during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and I'll be using some of the Vallejo range of paints to do so. After assembly, I primed the tank black. Priming is that ever-important first step to painting that gives you a good surface to paint on, but can also assist you in your colour schemes as well. By using black here, it would allow me to form some dark shadows in the recesses. I used an airbrush primer, but it's not a requirement. Feel free to use whatever you have to hand, be it aerosol, airbrush or brush on. Just make sure that you use black. After priming, the first step was to create a reddish-brown coloration across the armor's surface using some flat brown. This would serve two purposes. First, it would create a lighter surface that would allow the next layer of Olive Drab to apply more easily, but it would also help to create a dirty and weathered surface. I applied this paint by dry brushing it on. This technique involves taking a large brush, dipping it into the paint, and then wiping away the paint onto a surface in order to spread the paint through the bristles as well as removing any excess. I personally chose to use my wet palette for this, but you could use a piece of paper instead. The paint was then applied across the entire surface of the tank using a series of quick brush strokes. Here it formed up mainly on the flat surfaces and edges, leaving the recesses largely untouched and the original black primer still visible. This combination of speedy application whilst also helping to bring out the surface details is super useful for speed painting and is a technique that I'll be employing across this tutorial. With the first layer of flat brown completed, I then repeated the same dry brushing process using some US Olive Drab. This was applied across the whole tank once again, but I didn't worry too much about getting them all the way into the recesses, leaving some of that flat brown just a little bit visible still. I also avoided the tank tracks themselves, using a smaller brush when necessary so that just the bogies inside the tracks were covered with the green colouring. Once this was done, I was left with a more recognisable olive drab coloration. While the olive drab had created the basic colour of the armour, this vehicle still had a lot of surface details like the hatches and rivets. To really bring these out to the forefront, I opted to perform one more dry brush. This time around, I used the much lighter khaki as well as a much lighter application of the paint. This ensured that the paint only accumulated onto the hard edges and rivets of the vehicle, which, when compared against the darker recesses, resulted in a greater degree of depth in the detail. However, the dry brushing didn't quite create as much contrast on its own, so I used my regular brush to very carefully pick out the rivets on an individual basis. Now that I had completed the armour, I could start working on some of the smaller details such as the rubber trims of the road wheels, the track pads, the machine guns, and some of the stowed items. For all of these areas, I opted to use some black grey. I applied this to my wet palette and added just a little bit of water to help the paint flow more easily. This was then carefully applied to these smaller details, paying attention to not overspill onto the other areas of the miniature. At this stage, I felt that some of the recesses weren't quite dark enough for my liking. I really wanted to push that contrast though, so I opted to apply a wash. Sometimes a wash is applied over the entire model, but this time I didn't want to darken things down too much, as the dry brushing had already achieved a lot of the shading. So I focused my application of the wash more directly, focusing it on the deep recesses and around some of the details like the tools and vision ports, essentially using it to help bring out the shading anywhere that was maybe looking a little too flat. But I wasn't done just yet. I still had a few little extra surface details to add in the form of scratches and paint chips. After all, painted surfaces will rarely stay pristine in a war zone. To achieve this effect realistically, I opted to use a little piece of torn foam alongside some of the tan paint dark sand. I dipped the foam into the paint and removed any excess from it, much like I did with my earlier dry brushing. This foam was lightly dabbed across the surfaces and edges, which resulted in small flecks of paint forming. By using a lighter paint here, these really stood out and gave the impression of damage to the surface, giving the tank a more realistic appearance. which left me with this completed M3 Lee, painted in a scheme used by US forces during the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Now, whilst I focus on a specific tank for this video, all the same colours and techniques can also be applied to other US vehicles from this period and theatre. I'll include all the paints in this guide in the description below, along with some affiliate links, so if you're looking to try out some of these things for yourself while supporting me in the process, I would be extremely grateful. Speaking of which, let me just say a huge thank you to my ever generous supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Seth Sewell, Ryan Little, Tim, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Limborg, Mr. Grimm, and Swedsman. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, via YouTube membership, or you just use my affiliates links, then it is the kind-hearted people, such as yourselves, that allow me to fund the tools and paints required to create these videos for you. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.